Well, natural history museums, as you have heard from my colleagues, have a great variety of activities associated with their work. I want to speak specifically about translating the collections that are, after all, the basis and the raison d'etre for these museums, translating those collections into environmental action. And it's my view that leading our audiences to action is a crucial part of natural history museums' moral obligation to society. We may have been created 100, 200 years ago to be cabinets of curiosities, collections of strange things that there are in the world. But it is also true that the world's great natural history museums are repositories of the history of life on Earth, and that the evidence in our collection is unique and irreplaceable. It's also true that we have an obligation to provide guidance and leadership in turning knowledge into action. Our collections contain answers to questions that could never have been conceived in the past when these collections were being built, and the technology is changing at a rate that scientific inquiry will be of a nature that we cannot imagine at present. What I can tell you, however, with absolute certainty is that you can never recreate these collections. You cannot go back to southern China in 1928 and collect pandas. You can't go to Guatemala in 1958 and collect frogs. And those specimens, with the answers to those as yet unconceived questions, are in our museum. In a recent conversation with a top scientist at the Field Museum, he objected to a statement that I had proposed for one of our documents. That statement said, "The Field Museum offers science as a force for good." His position was that science is neither good nor bad, and to assert that we were working for good distorted the scientific method. His position was that science describes what is. It may be accurate or inaccurate in its description, but it is not good or bad. He's right. But what one does with the discoveries of science can indeed be good or bad. To be sure, the good and the bad consequences may be just as complicated and nuanced as the science that underlies the consequence. One need only look at the use of antibiotics and fungicides in the agricultural industry to see both good and bad in the use of science. Museums are uniquely positioned in society to help the public navigate this complicated arena. The Scientific Academy places a very high premium on what is called often pure science. And we are obliged, more than any other institutions, to translate that pure science into the lives of our public through interpretation and action. One of the surprising discoveries that I made personally when I moved from the university world to the museum world — I spent my entire career as an academic until I became president of the Field Museum — one of the things that I discovered was the remarkable public trust that museums enjoy. In a university context, it was always frustrating to me that in matters of scientific consequence to the public, global warming, habitat loss, biodiversity, environmental degradation, and the like, would be met with skepticism whenever a professor spoke. And the reason was that there was the expectation that another professor somewhere else would have a different view on the matter. This is not so for museums. When someone speaks on one of these topics from the museum, they speak not as an individual, but as a representative of the entire institution. And their authority is much greater than it is for individual academics. Now, I find this personally dismaying. I don't like the fact that the institution you represent carries more weight than the scientific fact you may be asserting, but that's the case. Now, translating the public's trust into understanding and action requires creative, focused care. In the current political environment that we find ourselves in, not only the United States, but in much of Europe as well, people are so antagonistic to ideas outside of their particular worldviews that great care is necessary in walking the very narrow path that Bruno alluded to, of walking right up to the political assertion that will make you part of the fray and standing back and retaining your scientific authority. But it's precisely because museums are not government, we are not academia, and we are not non-governmental organizations with specific agendas. And it's precisely for that reason that we are trusted in the way that we are. Much of the world longs for trustworthy commentary on scientific matters that are subject to political obfuscation, and they turn to museums for that commentary. We owe it to those audiences to deliver. 25 years ago, the Field Museum began an effort to translate the collections-based science of the museum into meaningful action that would significantly preserve biodiversity on this living planet. In 1993, the centenary of the Field Museum's founding, the visionary president of the Field Museum at that time, William Sandy Boyd, saw the museum's highest relevance in focusing on how it could best use the information contained in its collections to mitigate the impact of human beings on the environment. This unit has morphed into the Keller Science Action Center at the Field Museum. Around that time, Sir Peter Crane became the Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Field Museum. The museum had reorganized its scientific staff into two units. One combined the staffs of botany, geology, and zoology into a Center for Evolutionary and Environmental Biology. The second became the Center for Cultural Understanding and Change. It was focused on anthropology, but not the classical academic anthropology. It was focused on cross-cultural understanding. I share these organizational details not because I expect that you are really hanging on how we are organized at the Field Museum, but to simply recognize that the museum's effectiveness and the museum's continued effectiveness requires constant adaptation in institutional organization. You cannot take the structure and focus of a museum created 100 or 200 years ago and not change it continuously to adapt to new scientific reality. Very quickly, the staff who were focused on translating the research of the museum into environmental action saw that the traditional academic approach to conservation would be inadequate. Under the leadership of Deborah Moskowitz, the Office of Environmental and Conservation Programs was created. This separate unit had a total of merely 2.5 full-time equivalent staff. This small staff began to support and energize the local and international partnerships that we could create around the world. It created a coalition of local organizations dedicated to enhancing the natural environment of the Chicago region. And from this initial work, two new entities were created: Chicago Wilderness and the Chicago Cultural Alliance. Chicago Wilderness was begun in the Field Museum with a gathering of 30 groups concerned to preserve the natural assets of the Chicago region. Chicago Wilderness today continues to flourish and has grown into an organization that now includes more than 200 organizations throughout the Chicago region. And those organizations range from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to mothers and fathers who garden in their backyards. These 200 organizations have united into a single voice that is a powerful influence on the Chicago cultural and economic region. In addition to this, the unit of 2.5 individuals in the Field Museum created something called the Chicago Cultural Alliance, which banded the cultural and ethnic units of Chicago, and Chicago is a very segregated organization, a very segregated city, into a single voice speaking up for the people of the city of Chicago. Watching these two organizations together and their effectiveness influenced the Field Museum's approach to conservation in general. And what they came up with was what we call a quality of life assertion. That is to say that while we are grounded in the preservation of individual species, the discovery of new species, until you translate what that means into the lives of the individuals who are around those species, it's of no effective environmental consequence. Quality of life conservation involves listening to the inhabitants of a target region with great care to let them inform us of those aspects of their lives that are the most valuable, the most prized, and therefore the most likely to be preserved with enduring commitment. In the neotropics, where we do a great deal of our work, this approach has meant that the indigenous people's voices are given a volume and a level of privilege that is rare, if not unprecedented. In the last 25 years, we have conducted 30 rapid inventories, 23 alone in the Western Amazon, and we have done this by taking our scientists who rappel from helicopters into target areas to conduct these inventories. These inventories are conducted by teams of 30 to 40 scientists who are the usual botanists, herpetologists, geologists, ornithologists, mammalogists, ichthyologists, and entomologists. But it also consists of social scientists, specially trained to elicit from indigenous populations those elements most essential and prized for their quality of life. It may seem surprising at first blush to know that in every instance over the past 30 rapid inventories of the past 25 years, quality of life concerns have been exactly coincident with conservation concerns. What these people want to preserve is what we want to preserve. Indigenous populations want their lives in the rainforest to be protected. They do not aspire to Western urbanized values. They do not wish for money and technology. They want to preserve what they understand to be their quality of lives. Listening to them is the top priority for us. The scientific teams of our rapid inventories, which always include expertise from regional institutions, then synthesize their findings after 4 weeks in the field. They assess the threats, opportunities, and assets that have been discovered. This assessment is then presented in the form of a conservation roadmap that's presented to local, regional, and national authorities. In many instances, the roadmap has been presented to representatives of extractive industries as well, the oil and timber industries in particular, as well as the mining industries. These presentations are not the end of the Field Museum's involvement. Members of our rapid inventory team continue to work with policymakers, political authorities, local leaders, and others to encourage the implementation of this conservation roadmap. The Field Museum's approach has been successful. In the past 20 years, we have provided the governments of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador with the results of these rapid inventories. This work has resulted directly in the creation of 18 protected areas covering some 9.6 million hectares of precious Amazonian rainforest. We continue to work in this region and are focusing on new work in Guyana and Colombia, as well as continuing in Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And when all regions in which we have worked are included, the Field Museum is responsible for contributing to the protection of more than 12.5 million hectares of land, and we have specific plans over the next 10 years to expand that to almost 90 million hectares. There are 3 fundamental elements to the Field Museum's approach, and each is essential. Number 1, a broad spectrum of stakeholders and scientists must be involved in building a consensus of conservation action. Number two, the locally affected population must be given a prominent voice in building that consensus. And number three, the process must result in products that can actually be used by decision makers to turn the conservation roadmap into policy and action. 5 years ago, a group from the University of Maryland with the awkward name of the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center offered the scientific community a definition of what they discovered as a new term. They called it translational ecology. Their definition is long and academic, but it calls for boundary-spanning environmental science that leads to actionable research. Colleagues at the Field Museum have been pursuing this wise path for 20 years. They have been spanning boundaries of regions, disciplines, and politics, and they have done so to encourage action. It works. And it works because of the trust that museums have built over the past centuries. It works because of the perceived scientific and political neutrality of museums. And it works because it results in outcomes that lead to action. It is, in my view, that this sort of action is the future of natural history museums. Our collections are the repositories of the history of life on Earth, and that history must be the basis for the preservation of life on Earth in addition to its history. Thank you.